Library Use Exhoradrum. Book 1 of Heaven and Hell. The great conflict. Since the beginning, the forces of light and darkness have engaged in an eternal war. The great conflict, whose victor will rise from the apocalyptic ashes to hold sway over all creation. To this end, the angels of the high heavens adhere to strict militaristic disciplines. Seraphim warriors strike at the enemies of light with swords imbued with righteous wrath and justice. The angels believe that only absolute discipline can properly restore order to the myriad realms, while the demonic denizens of the burning hells hold that absolute chaos is the true nature of all things. The battles of the great conflict rage across both time and space, often infringing upon the very fabric of reality itself. From the crystal arch at the very heart of the high heavens to the arcane hell force of the underworld, the warriors of these eternal realms journey to wherever their timeless conflict carries them. The legendary deeds of the heroes of the realms beyond elicit both veneration and insight. The greatest of these heroes was Izael, lieutenant to the archangel Tyrael and bearer of the angelic runic blade at Shirath. He once led a fierce attack upon the hell force as the creation of the dark demon Lord Shadow Fang was nearing completion. His quest was to destroy both wielder and weapon, a charge that he was destined never to complete. Izael was overcome by the legions of chaos and, tragically, was lost to the darkness. His fate stands as testament to the fact that angels and demons alike shall fearlessly enter into any domain, so long as their hated enemies dwell within. Although the great conflict burned hotter and longer than any of the stars in the sky, neither side could gain dominion over the other for long. Both factions sought some way to turn the tides of the war to their favor. With the ascension of man and his mortal realm, the great conflict ground to a mysterious halt. Both armies paused in a breathless stalemate, waiting to see to whose side man would eventually turn. Mortals had the unique ability to choose between darkness and light, and it was held that this would be the deciding factor in the outcome of the great conflict. Thus, the agents of the nether realms descended to the mortal realm to vie for the favor of man. The sin war. The coming of the great conflict to the mortal realm is known as the sin war. Angels and demons, disguising themselves while traveling amongst men, attempted to secretly lure mortals to their respective causes. Over time, the forces of darkness discovered that mortals responded much more to brute force than to subtle coercion, and so began to terrorize man into submission. The angels fought to defend humanity against this demonic oppression, but all too often their austere methods and severe punishments succeeded only in alienating those whom they sought to protect. The violent battles of the sin war occurred often, but they were seldom witnessed by the prying eyes of man. Only a few enlightened souls were aware of the supernatural beings that walked amongst the huddled masses of humanity. Powerful mortals arose and accepted the challenge of the sin war, aligning themselves with both sides in the great conflict. The legendary deeds of these great mortal warriors served to earn both the respect and hatred of the netherworlds. Although lesser demons kneeled before those possessing power and strength, they also cursed the very existence of mortal man. Many of these fiends believed that the deadlock brought about by the emergence of man was a perverse offense to their higher role in the great scheme of things. This jealousy of man led to harsh, atrocious acts of violence by the demons against the mortal realm. Some men learned of this deep hatred and used it against the denizens of the underworld. One such mortal, Thorazon the Summoner, delighted in summoning demons and then breaking them to his will. Thorazon, along with his brother Bartok, were members of the Eastern Mage clan known as the Vizjari. This mystic clan studied the ways of demons and had catalogued their lore for generations. Empowered by this knowledge, Thorazon was able to take the work of the Vizjari and pervert it for his demented purposes. The denizens of hell sought revenge against this bold mortal, but Thorazon managed to keep himself well protected within his arcane sanctuary. Bartok, the brother of Thorazon, was eventually lured to the side of darkness. He was granted exceptional strength and longevity, and fought alongside the legions of hell against the cursed Vizjari, and eventually his own brother during the Sin War. Although Bartok was renowned amongst the warriors of many realms, his dominance in battle came with a terrible price. An insatiable lust for mortal blood pervaded his every thought and deed. Bartok soon became as fond of bathing in the blood of his enemies as he did of shedding it, and in time he came to be known only as the Warlord of Blood. The Dark Exile 7 is the number of the powers of hell, and 7 is the number of the great evils. Duriel, the Lord of Pain, and Ariel, the Maiden of Anguish, Belial, the Lord of Lights, as Edmurden, the Lord of Sin. These are the true names of the lesser of the great evils. For ages uncounted each have ruled over their own domains within the burning hells, seeking absolute dominion over their infernal brethren. As the lesser four continuously vied for the control of those forces that dwell within their realms, the greater three held absolute power over the whole of hell. The lesser four used dark and evil measures in their quest for power, and herein begins the legend of the Dark Exile. Mephisto, the Lord of Hatred, Baal, the Lord of Destruction, Diablo, the Lord of Terror. These are the primevals of hell that wielded their power as a dark, sovereign triumvirate. The three brothers ruled over the lesser four by brutal force and malicious cunning. Being the eldest and strongest of the evils, the three brothers were responsible for countless victories against the armies of the light. Although they never held sway over the high heavens for long, the three were justly feared by enemies and subjects alike. With the ascension of man and the subsequent standstill of the great conflict, the three brothers began to devote their energies to the perversion of mortal souls. The three realized that man was the key to victory in the war against heaven, and thus altered their rigid agenda that they had propagated since the beginning. This change caused many of the lesser evils to question the authority of the three. and so brought about a great rift between the primevals and their servitors. In their ignorance, the lesser evils began to believe that the three were afraid to continue the war with heaven. Frustrated by the cessation of the war, Azedmurden and Belial saw the situation as their chance to overthrow the primevals and take control of hell for themselves. The two demon lords made a pact with their minor brethren, assuring them that the wretched plague of humanity would not deter the ultimate victory of the sons of hell. Azedmurden and Belial devised a plan to end the stalemate, achieve victory in the sin war, and ultimately ride the bloody crest of the great conflict straight into the very arms of Armageddon. Thus, a great revolution was set into motion as all of hell went to war against the three brothers. The brothers fought with all of the savagery of the underworld, and to their credit, annihilated a third of hell's treacherous legions. In the end, however, they were overcome by the Horned Death led by the traitors Azedmurden and Belial. The primevals, weakened and bodiless, were banished to the mortal realm where Azedmurden hoped that they would remain trapped forever. Azedmurden believed that with the three set loose upon humanity, the angels would be forced to turn their focus on the mortal plane, thus leaving the gates of heaven abandoned and defenseless. Those few demons who still pledged allegiance to the three brothers fled the wrath of Azedmurden and Belial, escaping to the realm of man to seek out their lost masters. As the war fires died out upon the battlefields of hell, Azedmurden and Belial began to argue over which of them held the higher authority. The pact that they had made quickly fell to ashes as the two demon lords took up arms against each other. The legions of hell that remained were polarized behind either warlord, launching themselves into a bloody civil war that has lasted to this day. The binding of the three in the ancient days, before the rise of the Western empires, the dark and terrible entities known as the three evils were exiled to the world of man. These eternal entities wandered throughout the waking world and fed upon the lusts of men, leaving chaos and attrition in their wake. The evils turned father against son and prompted many great nations into brutal and petty wars. Their exile from hell left them with an insatiable hunger to bring suffering and pain to all who would not kneel before them, and so the three brothers ravaged the lands of the Far East for countless centuries. Eventually, the secretive order of mortal magi was gathered together by the enigmatic archangel Tyrael. These sorcerers were to hunt the three evils and put an end to their vicious rampage. The order, known as the Horadrim, consisted of wizards from the diverse and numerous mage clans of the East. Employing disparate magical practices and disciplines, this unlikely brotherhood succeeded in capturing two of the brothers within powerful artifacts called soulstones. Mephisto and Baal, trapped within the swirling, spiritual constraints of the soulstones, were then buried beneath the dunes of the desolate eastern sands. The powers of hatred and wanton destruction seemed to diminish in the east as a nervous peace began to settle over the land. Yet, For many decades the Horadrim continued their grim search for the third brother, Diablo. They knew that if the Lord of Terror was left untamed there could never be any lasting peace within the realm of humanity. The Horadrim followed in the wake of terror and anarchy that spread throughout the western lands. After a great battle which claimed the lives of many brave souls, the Lord of Terror was captured and imprisoned within the last of the Soul Stones by a group of Horadrim monks led by the initiate Jared Kane. These monks carried the cursed stone to the land of Conduras and buried it within a secluded cave near the river Talsanda. Above this cave the Horadrim constructed a great monastery from which they could continue to safeguard the Soul Stone. As ages passed, the Horadrim constructed the network of catacombs beneath the monastery to house the earthly remains of the martyrs of their order. Generations passed in Conduras, and the numbers of the Horadrim slowly dwindled. With no quests left to undertake, and too few sons to sustain their guardianship, the once powerful order faded into obscurity. Eventually, the great monastery that they had built fell to ruins as well. Although villages grew and thrived around the shell of the old monastery, no one knew of the dark, secret passageways that stretched into the cold earth beneath it. None could have dreamed of the burning red gem that pulsed within the labyrinth's heart. Library Use Ex Horadrim. Book to the Return of Terror. The lands of Conduras. Years after the last of the Horadrim had died, a great and prosperous society grew in the lands of the West. As time wore on, many Eastern pilgrims settled in the lands surrounding Conduras and soon established small, self-contained kingdoms. A few of these kingdoms bickered with Conduras over holdings of property or routes of trade. These squabbles did little to upset the lasting peace of the West, and the great northern kingdom of Westmarch proved to be a strong ally of Conduras as the two lands steadily engaged in ventures of barter and commerce. During this time, a bold, new religion of the light known as the Karam began to spread throughout the kingdom of Westmarch and into many of its northern principalities. The Karam, founded in the Far East, implored followers to enter into the light and forsake the darkness that lurked within their souls. The people of Westmarch adopted the statutes of the Karam as their sacred mission in the world. Westmarch began to turn towards its neighbors, expecting them to embrace this new beginning as well. Tensions rose between the kingdoms of Westmarch and Conduras as the priests of the Karam began to preach their foreign dogma whether they were welcomed or not. It was then that the great northern Lord Leoric came unto the lands of Conduras and, in the name of the Karam, declared himself king. Leoric was a deeply religious man and had brought many knights and priests with him that comprised his Order of the Light. Leoric and his trusted advisor, the Archbishop Lazarus, made their way to the city of Tristram. Leoric appropriated the ancient, decrepit monastery on the outskirts of the town for his seat of power and renovated it to match its time-lost glory. Although the free people of Conduras were not pleased with being placed under the sudden rule of a foreign king, Leoric served them with justice and might. Eventually, the people of Honduras grew to respect the kindly Eric, sensing that he sought only to guide and protect them against the oppression of darkness. The awakening not long after Eric took possession of Honduras. The power long asleep awakened within the dark recesses beneath the monastery. Sensing that freedom was within his grasp, Diablo entered the nightmares of the archbishop and lured him into the dark, subterranean labyrinth. In his terror, Lazarus raced throughout the abandoned hallways until he at last came to the chamber of the burning soulstone. No longer in command of his body or spirit, he raised the stone above his head and uttered words long forgotten in the realm of mortals. His will destroyed, Lazarus shattered the soulstone upon the ground. Diablo once again came into the world of man. Although he was released from his imprisonment within the soulstone, the Lord of Terror was still greatly weakened from his long sleep and required an anchor to the world. Once he had found a mortal form to wear, he could begin to reclaim his vastly depleted power. The great demon weighed the souls residing in the town above, and chose to take the strongest of them, that of King Eric. For many months King Eric secretly fought the evil presence that twisted his thoughts and emotions. Sensing that he had been possessed by some unknown evil, Eric hid his dark secret from his priests, hoping that somehow his own devout righteousness would be enough to exorcise the corruption growing inside him. He was sorely mistaken. Diablo stripped away the core of Eric's being, burning away all honor and virtue from his soul. Lazarus too had fallen under the sway of the demon, keeping close to Eric at all times. Lazarus worked to conceal the plans of his new master from the Order of Light, hoping that the demon's power would grow, well concealed amongst the servants of the Cherem. The priests of the Cherem and the citizenry of Honduras recognized the disturbing change within their liege. His once proud and rugged form became distorted and deformed. King Eric became increasingly deranged and ordered immediate executions of any who dared to question his methods or authority. Eric began to send his knights to other villages to bully their townspeople into submission. The people of Honduras who had once grown to see great honor in their ruler began to call Eric the Black King. Driven to the brink of madness by the Lord of Terror, King Eric slowly alienated his closest friends and advisors. Blackman, captain of the Knights of the Order of Light and honored champion of the Cherem, tried to discern the nature of his king's deteriorating spirit. Yet that every turn the Archbishop Lazarus would waylay Blackman and admonish him for questioning the actions of the king. As tensions grew between the two, Lazarus charged Blackman with treason against the kingdom. To the priests and knights of Eric's court, the prospect of Blackman committing treason was ridiculous. Blackman's motives were honorable and just, and soon many began to question the reason of their once beloved king. Eric's madness was growing more obvious with each passing day. Sensing that the advisers of the court were becoming increasingly suspicious of foul treachery, Lazarus desperately sought to contain the eroding situation. the Archbishop masterfully convinced the delusional Lioric that the Kingdom of Westmarch was plotting against him, secretly planning to dethrone him and annex Honduras into its own lands. Lioric flew into a rage and summoned his advisers to his side. Manipulated by the Archbishop, the paranoid king declared a state of war between the kingdoms of Honduras and Westmarch. Lioric ignored the warnings and admonishments of his advisers, and the royal army of Honduras was ordered to the north to engage in a war that they did not believe in. Lachman was appointed by Lazarus to lead the armies of Honduras into Westmarch. Although Lachman argued against the necessity of the coming conflict, he was honor-bound to uphold the will of his king. Many of the high priests and officials were forced to travel to the north as emissaries on errands of diplomatic urgency, as well. The desperate ploy of Lazarus had succeeded in sending many of the king's more troublesome advisers to their certain deaths. The darkening of Tristram, the absence of prying advisers and inquisitive priests left Diablo free to assume total control over the king's battered soul. As the Lord of Terror attempted to strengthen his hold upon the maddened king, he found that the lingering spirit of Lioric fought with him still. Although the control over Lioric that Diablo held was formidable, the demon knew that in his weakened state he could never take complete possession of his soul as long as a glimmer of his will remained. The demon lord sought a fresh and innocent host upon which to build his terror. The demon relinquished his control over Lioric, but the king's soul was left corrupted and his mind crazed. Diablo began to search throughout Honduras for the perfect vessel to act as his focus, and found such a soul easily within his reach. Enjoined by his dark master, Lazarus kidnapped Albrecht, the only son of Lioric, and dragged the terrified youth down into the blackness of the labyrinth. Flooding the boy's defenseless mind with the essence of pure terror, Diablo easily took possession of the young Albrecht. Pain and fire raced through the child's soul. Hideous laughter filled his head and clouded his thoughts. Paralyzed with fear, Albrecht felt the presence of Diablo within his mind as it seemed to push him down, deeper and deeper into darkness and oblivion. Diablo gazed upon his surroundings through the eyes of the young prince. A lustful hunger still tortured the demon after his frustrating bout for control over Lioric, but the nightmares of the boy provided ample substance to sate him. Reaching deep into Albrecht's subconscious, Diablo ripped the greatest fears of the child from their hiding places and gave them breath. Albrecht watched, as if out of a dream. Twisted and disfigured forms appeared all around him. Unholy, writhing visages of terror danced about him, chanting choruses of obscenities. All of the monsters that he had ever imagined or believed that he had seen in his life became flesh and were given life before him. Large bodies comprised of living rock erupted from the walls and bowed to their dark masters. The ancient, skeletal corpses of the Horadrim arose from archaic crypts and lumbered off into the red-washed corridors beyond. As the cacophony of madness and nightmares hammered its final blow against Albrecht's shattered spirit, the bloodlust ghouls and demons of his mind scattered and scrambled maniacally into the lengthening passageways of his waking nightmares. The ancient catacombs of the Thoradrum had become a twisted labyrinth of raw, focused terror. Empowered by Diablo's possession of young Albrecht, the creatures of the boy's own imagination had gained corporeal form. So strong was the terror that grew inside of Albrecht, that the borders of the mortal realm began to warp and tear. The burning hell began to seep into the world of man and take root within the labyrinth. Beings and occurrences displaced by time and space, and long lost to the history of man, were pulled screaming into the ever-expanding domain. The body of Albrecht, fully possessed by Diablo, began to distort and change. The small boy grew and his eyes blazed as tendril-like spines ripped through his flesh. Great arched horns erupted from Albrecht's skull as Diablo altered the form of the child to match that of his demonic body. Deep within the recesses of the labyrinth, the growing power was being harnessed. When the moment was right, Diablo would venture once more into the mortal world and free his captive brothers Mephisto and Baal. The primevals would be reunited, and together they would reclaim their rightful place in hell. The fall of the Black King. The war against the zealous armies of Westmarch ended with a horrible slaughter. Was the army of Count Duros ripped to shreds by the superior numbers and defensive positions of Westmarch? Blackman quickly gathered together those who were not captured or killed and ordered the retreat back to the safety of Count Duros. They returned to find the town of Tristram in shambles. King Leoric, deep within the throes of madness, went into a rage when he learned that his son was missing. After scouring the village with the few guards that remained with him at the monastery, Leoric had decided that the townsfolk had abducted his son and hidden him somewhere. Although the townsfolk denied any knowledge of Prince Albrecht's whereabouts, Leoric insisted that they had crafted a conspiracy against him, and that they would pay the price for such treachery. The mysterious disappearance of the Archbishop Lazarus left no one in Tristram with whom the king would take counsel. Overcome by grief and dementia, Leoric had many of the townsfolk executed for the crime of high treason. As Lamphnan and his fellow survivors returned to confront their king, Leoric sent his few remaining guards against them. Believing that Lamphnan was somehow part of the townsfolk's conspiracy, Leoric decreed that he and his party were to die. Lamphnan, finally realizing that Leoric was beyond salvation, ordered his men to defend themselves. The ensuing battle carried them down into the very halls of the darkened monastery, bringing a final desecration to the once holy sanctum of the Thoradrum. Lamphnan won a bitter-sweet victory as his men were forced to kill all of Leoric's deceived protectors. They cornered the ravenous king within his own sanctuary and begged him to explain the atrocities he had committed. Leoric only spat at them and cursed them for traitors against both his crown and the light. Lamphnan walked slowly towards his king and sorrowfully drew his sword. Full of grief and rage, all honor having been cast to the winds, Lamphnan ran his blade through Leoric's shriveled, blackened heart, The once noble king screamed an unearthly death cry, and as his madness finally overtook him, he brought down a curse upon those who had so betrayed him. Calling upon the forces of darkness that he had spent his entire life combating, he condemned Lachlan and the others to eternal damnation. In that last, fleeting moment within the heart of the monastery, all that was ever virtuous or honorable about the stewards of Honduras was shattered forever. The reign of Diablo the Black King lay dead, slain at the hands of his own priests and knights. The young Prince Albrecht was still missing, and the proud defenders of Honduras were no more. The people of Tristram looked about their lifeless town and were greatly dismayed. Awash in feelings of both relief and remorse, they soon realized that their troubles had merely begun. Strange, eerie lights appeared in the darkened windows of the monastery. Misshapen, leathery-skinned creatures were seen venturing forth from the shadows of the church. Horrible, wounded cries seemed to linger on the wind, emanating from deep underground. It became apparent that something quite unnatural had infested the once holy site. Travelers on the roads surrounding Tristram were accosted by cloaked riders that seemed to now constantly roam the deserted countryside. Many villagers fled Tristram, making their way to other towns or kingdoms, fearing some unnamed evil that seemed to wait in the shadows all around them. Those few who chose to remain seldom ventured out at night, and never tread foot upon the grounds of the cursed monastery. Whispered rumors of poor, innocent people being abducted in the night by wicked, nightmarish creatures filled the halls of the local inn. With no king, no law, and no army left to defend them, many of the townsfolk began to fear an attack from the things that now dwelt beneath their town. The Archbishop Lazarus, frayed and disheveled, returned from his absence and assured the townsfolk that he too had been ravaged by the growing evil of the monastery. With their desperate need for reassurance clouding their good judgment, Lazarus whipped the townspeople into a frenzied mob. Reminding them that Prince Albrecht was still unaccounted for, he persuaded many of the men to follow him into the depths of the monastery to search for the boy. They gathered torches and soon the night air glowed with the flickering light of hope. They armed themselves with shovels, picks and scythes, and so prepared, they boldly followed the treacherous archbishop straight into the fiery maw of hell itself. The few who survived the horrible fate that awaited them returned to Tristram and recounted what they could of the ordeal. Their wounds were terrible, and even the skills of the healer could not save some of them. As the stories of demons and devils spread, a stifling, primal terror began to consume the hearts of all of the town's inhabitants. It was a terror that none of them had ever known. Deep beneath the foundations of the ruined monastery, Diablo gorged himself upon the fears of the mortals above him. He slowly sank back into the welcoming shadows and began to harness his depleted power. He smiled to himself in the sheltering darkness, for he knew that the time of his final victory was fast approaching. KTHXBAI accurate reports on the nature of the horrors that lie below the church come to light more rarely than survivors. I have attempted to provide a base knowledge of what awaits you by searching through our vast libraries for historical and scientific tomes recounting the Horagram's epic war against the Three. I have summarized the information that I discovered. Due to the length of time that has passed since most of the original accounts were written, and the uncertainty surrounding the present evil that plagues this land, I cannot guarantee the veracity of this information. I do, however, believe that this information is as accurate as possible under these trying circumstances. It is known that the three brothers often acted through personal servants. While I would not classify all of these servants as demons, they do represent the most horrible aspects of their masters. What follows is what has been documented concerning the creatures that were known to serve the brothers during their reign of evil. It should be noted that in their battle against the seraphim, the brothers would constantly twist and change their servants to best resist the powers that they were facing. Two demons of the same physical shape may have dramatically different weaknesses, depending upon the whims of their masters. The specific species described herein were those most commonly encountered by the Horagram. Take the greatest of care when journeying through the cursed lands. It is well known that the creatures of darkness are a cowardly lot, and will attack using strength of numbers to their advantage whenever possible. I fear the knowledge contained herein is incomplete, at best, for there were no living witnesses of the most powerful horrors. If one of the three has truly come free of his binding, he will call as many of these infernal servants to him as possible, as well as creating new and more powerful minions to command. Viscarbaro's chief librarian Zeresh Covenant Brotherhood of the Vizjari. The minions of darkness fall into three categories, and are divided according to their masters. Study these words well, for this knowledge may be all that keeps your immortal soul from being devoured by the denizens of the underworld. Mephisto, the Lord of Hatred. Odium. The legions of Mephisto are driven by a hatred of all living things, especially those who are pure of heart. He counts as minions both the walking dead, who forever seek vengeance upon the living, as well as a host of demonically corrupted creatures whose twisted limbs and misshapen bodies leave them in eternal agony and rage. Skeletons osseum animatum. These are the skeletal remains of warriors who either died as soldiers in some dark campaign, or were betrayed by those they most trusted. Now animated by unnatural forces, these troops of the damned forever seek new recruits to join their ranks. If our greatest fears do prove to be true, the skeletal warriors that are rumored to haunt the town of Tristram might well be the corrupted remains of the valiant Horagram monks laid to rest in the catacombs beneath the church. Only an incredibly potent evil could have disturbed the peaceful slumber of these eremites. Skeletons are usually found in places where the dead are laid to rest or at the sites of great battles. While physically fragile, they are never lacking in numbers, for those that fall to them in combat are damned to an eternal lust for living blood. coupled with their unthinking rage. This makes them a dangerous opponent. Zombies. KTHXBAI Anima 2's worm-ridden and reeking of foul decay. Zombies are formed from the corpses of men executed for committing the most depraved and degenerate crimes against the innocent. They are driven by both the hatred that consumed them in life and an insatiable hunger for the flesh of the living. Tenacious and possessing stamina of infernal origin, zombies and their ilk make for a difficult encounter. Fortunately, these undead minions are lacking in both wit and mobility, which can be used to great effect against them. Overlords, tyrannus, pinguis, even the seraphim are not immune to the corruption of the Dark Lords. One such angel, Anakreus, was proud of his beauty and boasted loudly of his purity and worth. His thoughts became so clouded that he believed himself to be above both angel and demon, and he left the high heavens to form his own dominion. He constructed a great cathedral of mirrored glass and crystal, and followers flocked to him, drawn by his numinous charm and wealth. Once Anakreus had gathered a sizable army, he decided to prove his power. Anakreus first laid siege to an infernal temple devoted to the worship of Mephisto, but made the foolish mistake of overestimating his prowess. The armies of Anakreus laid waste to the temple and killed the dark monks that dwelled within. The three evils had considered the vain warrior a mere nuisance and amusement until this time, but this was an insult that they could not bear. Mephisto himself is said to have appeared at the cathedral of Anakreus. He laid waste to the church and the surrounding countryside. The Lord of Hatred took the proud archangel and his followers captive. He bound Anakreus with tremendous chains and slowly tore the wings from the back of the angel. Great barbed hooks were then used to stretch out the once glowing skin, and his features were distorted by vile powers. Many of the followers of Anakreus were given as gifts to Baal and Diablo, but the rest were molded to match the bloated image of the now crippled angel. To this day, Anakreus is said to be trapped in hell within a chamber of mirrors, his eyelids torn from his face as he is forced to gaze upon his misshapen form for all eternity. His misguided followers now serve as hell's taskmasters, taking the anguish of their lost glory out upon the bodies of others. These grotesque demons have considerable brawn hidden beneath their layers of greasy flab. Do not underestimate their strength, for their intelligence for crossing swords with them is ill-advised. You will be far better served to combat them with ranged weapons or magic. Magma demons dominate harder during the Great Conflict. Tremendous battles were fought in both the high heavens and the burning hells. Both sides often carried the conflict deep within the realms of their enemies. During one epic battle into the very heart of Mephisto's fiery lair, a group of brave seraphim warriors fronted an assault against the Lord of Hatred himself. One of these angelic soldiers made a bold attack and struck a fierce blow that caused the foul blood of Mephisto to rain upon the ground. Each drop that fell seared through the crust of hell itself and formed powerful demons shaped from molten rock. These demons quickly rose to the aid of their masters, and drove back the forces of light by striking them with thrown masses of lava that seared both flesh and bone with the intensity of the burning hells. The losses dealt by these magma demons were tremendous. Baal, Lord of Destruction, Exodium. The soldiers of Baal seek the undoing of the universe. They strive for ultimate disorder and destruction, and to this end covet the destruction of all they behold. Order is an abhorrence to them, and these creatures are the manifestation of the forces of chaos. Fallen ones nus improbus. Swarms of these impish terrors have been known to come out of the night and tear apart a sleeping village in minutes. Small of stature and simian in appearance, these creatures possess surprising strength and unnatural agility. Other than killing, the only act which gives them pleasure is breeding, so expect to encounter them in large packs. The small size of these devils does fill them with cowardice, however, and this fear can be used against them. They prefer to attack under the guise of darkness and in large numbers whenever possible. If they are shown great strength, preferably by killing one of their kind, they will retreat and regroup. Do not turn your back on them, though, for their appetite for destruction will eventually overcome their caution and they will attempt to strike again. Goatmen carries demons. The lieutenants of Baal are bred for strength, endurance, and cunning. These demons constantly train themselves in the art of war, for battle is their bread and the blood of innocents their water. There are several known clans of goatmen, each given a different gift from their dark masters. It is believed that to earn their powers they once held mock wars in hell for the entertainment of the three brothers. Do not expect them to fight amongst themselves on the mortal realm, however, for they much prefer to slaughter the innocent. Like most of Baal's spawn, the bestiaries are incredibly strong and agile. Be especially wary of their archers, for they are renowned for the accuracy and power of their great bows. Fleet of foot, they may try to evade an unwary foe and then attack from a different angle. Spitting terrors. Bestiaries. After an especially violent battle, Baal enjoyed celebrating with his brothers by holding the disgusting feast of blood, human flesh, and other hellish delights. The bestiaries are the descendants of dog-like creatures that lived by feeding upon the remains of Baal's nightmarish feasts. The variety of vile substances that the creatures consumed, along with their close proximity to the Lord of Destruction, twisted and warped the viscera of these hounds of hell. This diabolic species is capable of spitting up a variety of caustic fluids and projecting them a considerable distance. Packs of these terrors are especially devastating, as their bile has been known to eat through the strongest of armor and poison the most hardy men. Great care must be taken when within the lair of these beasts. Their venom retains its potency for a considerable amount of time and puddles of it may be found everywhere. When killed, the beast's inner toxins eat through the now dead flesh, leaving a dangerous trap for those foolish enough to tread upon the corpse. Horned demons impetum cornuta used as living siege engines. There are numerous accounts of these juggernauts smashing into the lines of the seraphim and leaving only death and ruin in their wake. The skull and the single large horn in the snout of the demon are unnaturally durable. The horned demons prefer to wait until a clear path is available and then they charge towards their victims at incredible speeds. Be wary of this initial charge. It is far better to deal with these creatures in close quarters or with magic. Diablo, Lord of Terror, Matthews using illusion and fear as their greatest weapons. The attendants to Diablo are formidable adversaries. They prefer to wait for their opponent to display a moment of weakness before they attack. Equally dangerous in the dark or in your dreams, they are the fears of man made flesh by Diablo's will. These nightmares lurk at the edges of mortal perception from the moment that you take your first breath, and they long to be with you when you take your last. Winged fiends daily nefastus. Some people are so hungry for power and knowledge that they are willing to sacrifice their humanity to the lords of hell in exchange for gifts that inevitably turn against them. One such group, the Dark Cabal of Wizards, decided to take the power of creation into their own hands and magically created a race of creatures to act as servants and messengers. Using infernal abilities granted to them through their arcane pact, they formed small bat-winged imps that they believed would prove useful in carrying out deeds that were too trivial for their own efforts. Each of the sorcerers created an entity that reflected his magical specialization. The creatures thus created were small, nimble and possessed an unnatural cunning. At first the corrupt sorcerers were overjoyed at the success of their experiment, but they soon began to notice that the daily did not serve them as loyally as they had hoped. The creatures had taken to secretly feeding from the very essence of their masters, weakening them and eventually killing them. The sorcerers tried to destroy their creations, but the fiends banded together to combat them. The winged fiends had been secretly breeding outside of the sorcerers' domains, and swarms of them attacked, killing their former masters. To this day, the descendants of these creations terrorized the countryside. Do not underestimate these foul demons. They are physically weak, but possess great speed. Many of them possess unearthly abilities reflecting the powers of their creators, and they also enjoy using their razor-sharp claws and hook wings to tear the flesh from the faces of their victims. Scavengers Maleficus Vorax. Maleficus Vorax are the smallest of a related group of demonic creatures that feed upon carrion, mostly the remains of victims killed by their larger cousins. Unlike most scavengers, however, they are extremely aggressive and will not hesitate to attack anyone hapless enough to encounter them. They have powerful legs which they use for swift sprinting attacks, striking at vulnerable faces and throats. Their primary weakness is their voracious appetite. The smell of death may drive them into a feeding frenzy where they will stop their attacks to feast upon remains that are nearby. The hidden Methuselah. The hidden are the bull demon that haunt our dreams and live in the nightmares of children. Although they dwell at the edge of the physical and ethereal realms where they remain unseen by mortal's sight, they can quickly manifest and strike those that appear vulnerable. Methuselahs and others of their ilk feed on the essence of fear. When wounded, they will seek to retreat back into the ether to heal themselves. It is important to know that even while invisible, the creature exists partially on the physical realm, and can be affected by spells and weapons. Gargoyle Sinum vitiosum. In ages past, it was customary to decorate buildings with stone statues of demons that were enchanted to serve as guardians and protectors of those within. The misshapen figures of the statues were designed to taunt and anger any demons that attempted to gain entrance. Diablo worked to unlock the wards that protected these dreadnought images, and eventually was able to gift them with a Hadean life. The gargoyles arose from their captive sleep and swooped down to prey upon those whom they were created to protect. Naturally, the remaining statues were immediately destroyed, but there are Sinum that escaped and continue to terrorize the innocent to this day. The act of transforming from flesh to stone allows the creature to heal any wounds that it has suffered, so it is best to either avoid these demons entirely or to hunt them down until they are dead. Do not allow them to flee, for they will soon return in full force.